Yep.
Okay, so that should be recording now.
Great. Yeah, it says so, yeah, on my camera.
Awesome. All right, ready to go?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, Alex, I just want to start by saying thank you very much for taking the time to share your insights and your time and help a few of those who are either just thinking of or taking their first steps into a career with organisational psychology. So thank you very much.
Great. No, I'm happy to be here, Clifford. Yeah. No, so yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation, but yeah, and welcome to those people who tuned in.
Awesome. So, if for anyone who's gone through their psychology training at UQ in the last couple of years, they are probably familiar with you or familiar with you. And, I'm one of those people. I've had the pleasure of sitting under you in some of those lectures and studies, and it was great. Looking at, for those of you that haven't gone through UQ though, may not be as familiar with who you are. Just looking at your biography on the UQ page, there is a whole bunch of stuff here. You've got a bunch of awards from various associations, from the European Social Psychology Society. We've got political science awards. We've got APS, the BPS. So you've got a number of awards for your work and your studies. You've done it over in Europe. You've done it here in Australia. You're a prolific publisher. On here, it's got 3 books, 63 chapters, 356 journal articles, and it looks, by the looks of it, COVID hasn't slowed you down at all. Looking at the number, I think you've this year alone, you've got 1 book chapter and 7 journal articles, and it's not even May yet that have been published. So yeah. there's a bit of a rundown, but yeah. Let's hear from you. Who is Alex Haslam?
Well, as you say, I'm a social and organisational psychologist. So, I teach in the area of organisational psychology, and I research with a large number of colleagues, group processes, but in organisational, social, health, sporting contexts, and I guess over a long period of time, I've looked at different aspects of group functioning in those all types of contexts, and I guess particularly with a focus on leadership. So that's one of the things I think that the work that we have done that's been kind of most influential, and looking at different sort of components of leadership, but primarily from a sort of theoretical perspective, and trying to challenge some of the orthodoxies around the nature of leadership and the processes that make it effective, and challenging, I guess, also not just sort of the academic literature or academic ideas about that, but also popular ideas, which I think there's a close interrelationship between those things. But yeah, I mean, so I think and the outcome of really, I mean, I see the publications and the books and so on as just really testament to the sort of richness of the collaborations that I have and I've developed, with a lot of people in Australia, obviously, in UQ in Queensland, but also other places around Australia, but also around the world. So, and I think I've been very fortunate in the collaborators that I've had over the years, and still have, and I think we've been relatively fortunate. Well, in the scheme of things, very fortunate in Australia that there hasn't been a huge, interruption to that process. But I'm very mindful of the fact that that's also, in a sense, a reflection of sort of privilege, or privileged position that I sort of have, and I'm very mindful of the fact that the last year or so has been a lot crueler for a lot more people, and I think one of the things about the pandemic is that it's exacerbated inequality, and that's true in science kind of too. So, insofar as I was in a in a good sort of position beforehand, in a good department, a good university with good colleagues, and reasonably well resourced, we're pretty protected. But there's plenty of other people who are not in that kind of situation, and I wouldn't want to underestimate the importance of those kind of structural conditions for one's ability to be productive. So I don't, I think and there's a pretty healthy dose of luck in there too.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear you, and I know that like you are, I think that I've been relatively lucky throughout the pandemic, and my work has been pretty stable, but very mindful that some other people that don't have, as you said, the structures and scaffolding around their careers, particularly in the early part, I guess as well, have not fared so well.
Yeah, and I think, it's affected, I think, early career researchers more, people who've got insecure positions or on contracts, but also women, obviously, I think, and people who have child caring responsibilities or indeed responsibility for caring for, older adults, parents, or whatever, family members. So again, and I think, I think it's really mindful to think about what that sort of tells us about, the way organizations kind of work and who is in a certain sort of sense protected and who's maybe a little less, a bit more exposed to the sort of slings and arrows of outrageous fortunes. And we have a tendency as organizational psychologists, I think, and as psychologists generally, to attribute those things to internal characteristics like resilience or, fortitude or something of that form. And I see those things more as outcomes of some of these other processes than straightforward inputs, and I think if you put anybody in, a really difficult situation, they're going to, and with, the wrong kind of dynamics around them, they're going to struggle, and then if you're talking about something like leadership, part of the job about leadership is to try to, a large part of it is about managing those structural conditions, but also helping people to negotiate them when they are adverse, rather than, so in a sense, you're protecting people from the bad stuff, but also, trying to navigate a way for them to a sort of positive space in an organization. And again, you're not just doing that for them as individuals, you're doing it more broadly for the kind of groups that you manage, and I think I've been fortunate, that in the context of the pandemic, we have been, we've been on the receiving end of, I think, generally pretty good leadership. Like, so if I would just talk immediately, like, I think our departmental head, the university infrastructure at UQ, I think the people there have been very attuned to these issues in a way that they haven't always in other institutions. So again, I really wouldn't want to underestimate the importance of leadership to that either,
Yeah, no, definitely. And no, I definitely hear you there, Alex. As we've kind of mentioned, you've had a pretty successful career to date. Do you want to give us a brief summary?
Okay, yeah, okay. I mean, of the stuff I've done. Well, again, I started, I did my undergraduate degree in Scotland, and I did some just sort of basic, for my honours thesis. I worked with Margaret Wetherell, who's actually a pretty influential discourse analyst. She's a social psychologist, but she's not really an experimental social psychologist. She's a New Zealander, and she supervised my honours project. And that was on group decision making and the like. So that kind of went well. Her PhD supervisor had been John Turner at the University of Bristol, and in the time that when I was doing my honours year, John moved out to Australia, and Margaret has said, well, seeing as you kind of keen to do a PhD, and I'm not really so focused on like experimental psychology, you might want to think about going to. And she had come to Britain on a Commonwealth scholarship, and she said, you might want to think about applying for a Commonwealth scholarship to go to Australia to work with John, which is what I did. And that all came off. And so, I came to Australia, did my PhD at Macquarie University, and really was on social judgment and sort of stereotyping. Generally, that was the thing. But I spent a lot of time in my PhD really working on sort of theoretical issues in the social identity tradition, and John, of course, the progenitor of social identity theory and self-categorization theory, really working sort of closely kind of with him, and doing really basic social psychology. Then John got the chair at ANU, and we moved. A group of us kind of moved to Canberra then to work with him. I did my postdoc there, and then as I was coming, I did that for 3 or so years, and I was looking at basic group processes, standard stuff on decision making, stuff like that. But it turned out that I was kind of keen then to move into kind of a teaching role, but there were a lot of social psychologists there, and there was no prospect of any sort of jobs ever coming up in social psychology. So I started to and there was a gap in the teaching. There was a course, just a small course on organisational psychology that needed to be taught, and and I was kind of I was doing this stuff on sort of decision making and other kinds of things. Group processes more generally, and I'd read quite a bit of the organisational literature in an incidental way, often because I was sort of critical of it, and so I started doing that teaching, and then in the context of that, we were working on various kind of projects and books, basic social psychology books. But I guess the big thing was that after about 2 years of doing that teaching, I was looking at all the textbooks that were available, organisational textbooks, and when I looked at them all, I just thought that's just wrong, I mean, that was, I thought that, and everything about the way that they talked about pretty much everything that I was, interested in, whether it's leadership or group decision making or motivation, I thought they captured part of the story, but often totally misrepresented the nature of the group at the heart of organizational processes, based on my kind of, understanding and the research that I and colleagues have been doing then, particularly with John, around, social identity. There was no, really at that time, this was in the, late, 1990s, there was really no social identity research really in the organizational space. There were a few things, a few sort of seedlings. But then as I started to do that teaching, then I did more research in the organizational space with a range of people, really, and started to do that. And then I worked on writing this book. I thought, well, there's a real scope to really to accompany my teaching, but also just to start to curate all of the material, which now started to come on stream a bit. And then I wrote Psychology in Organizations, and that was published in 2001, really bringing that literature together and trying to formalize it, and that, I think, that book was quite a sort of catalyst. I think it was a bit of a sort of lightning rod for that work. Really at that time, then we moved back to the UK, and I worked with a whole raft of colleagues there on the kinds of issues that were emerging from the book, particularly people like Steve Reicher on kind of leadership. And I got involved in some really big, and Michelle Ryan as well on sort of gender and leadership, and got involved in some really kind of big projects there. And everything sort of took off from there, I guess. And there's obviously specific things that you could talk about. I guess the only two things, well, three things really. One was we did, with Steve, I did the BBC prison study, and that really alerted us to, again, ways in which lots of standard psychologies of group process and oppression, in organizational and other contexts are kind of wrong, I think. But also, critically, I think, really sheeted home the links, the close ties between organizational, social, and health processes. And I think one of the big problems in psychology is that those things are really quarantined. We have organizational psychology over here, and we have health psychology here, and clinical here, and social here, and cognition there. Well, the obvious point is that's not, your brain isn't organized like that, and the world isn't organized like that. So really then, I think and in particular, the thing that the BBC study allowed us to do was to see these links between organizational social process and then some of the health and clinical stuff in really interesting ways, I think. That spawned a big line of research really started out with the stuff on social identity and health and stress and depression and well-being. And that's now a really, and so really from one line of research, we got this organizational process thing, we got the book, The New Psychology of Leadership. Then we started this work on health. We got that led ultimately to another book, The New Psychology of Health. And I also, there was a sort of third strand of research, which I was really did with Michelle Ryan, which was on women and leadership. And in the context of doing that, we did a lot of stuff on the nature of women's leadership positions. And there was this kind of strong line of research on the glass cliff again, which has, you know, a kind of life of its own. Michelle really doing a lot of that work now. And again, all of those things I think have been, you know, they again, I see the role of myself and colleagues who worked on those things has really just been to kind of organize the field in a particular way and to demonstrate, identify some of the gaps, reorganize some of the literature in particular ways, articulate certain assumptions, clarify some of the misunderstandings, but also then, you know, set out a set of hypotheses, you know, based on the theory, but based on what we're seeing there, that I think, again, challenge some of the kind of mainstream views in those areas, but also point to those interlinking things. And again, I think the reason it's been influential very straightforwardly is not that we've actually influenced like older researchers, in many ways our peers or superiors. It's actually that we've influenced younger researchers and practitioners, and actually, you know, so you know, in terms of the way the field's developed, you know, and actually the reason that has been influential is because a lot of those young researchers are now not so young, they're sort of mid-career, and these ideas have been, you know, part of their development, you know, so, and that's sort of how science works, I think, you know, it's a generational thing. And I think now there's a new generation of social identity researchers in all of those fields who are doing really, really great work, applying it, you know, extending it, you know, doing all sorts of, you know, really, really ambitious kind of projects. And there's two things there. One is that, broadly speaking, that approach has proved to be very generative, very, you know, and broadly speaking, sort of correct. So most of the predictions I think that we have generated, I think, have been sort of validated in particular kinds of ways. So in a world where lots of psychological stuff is kind of, you know, hard to kind of replicate, or doesn't sort of, you know, is very exciting and snazzy and kind of glossy and shiny and sort of novel. I think, you know, social identity research is just, I think, really very solid. And I don't think, you know, I don't think a lot of my work is very flashy in that sense. And I've never been that excited by effects in the way that a lot of psychologists are. I'm much more interested in process. And I think, you know, and I think the fetishization of effects has been a huge problem for psychology, but just focusing on straightforward theory and process, I think, is a much better investment of your energies. And I think that's, again, the fact that we sort of just plugged away at this stuff and said, no, there's stuff here that you're not really picking up, and this is what it looks like. That's really now, I think, is really is sort of bearing fruit. But that's, you know, that's, you know, 20 sort of years down the track. And that was just you know, that was just based on the sorts of things we were doing 15 years ago. But now there's I again, working with, you know, just brilliant colleagues, you know, a lot younger than me now, and I think they're doing much better work, much better research than I was doing at the time in my career, and that's really good to see. So that, I mean, that wasn't short; that was kind of long. There was lots of threads there and so on, but maybe just gives you a bit of a sense of, yeah, of how these things kind of work out. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it, I think, it's a group process. So again, it's not really, if you look at it, you know, you could explain all of that just as a function of the currents and the collective currents that have shaped my work, but the teams of people that I've worked with. But in that context, I've benefited from great leadership of other people. And again, to the extent that I've done leadership, again, it's been with and for, you know, a really effective group of people, I think. So again, I would encourage people not to kind of focus like on me as an individual, but think about the kind of social networks and the sort of group dynamics that, you know, that have been swirling around me, that, you know, I've been part of. I mean, and I think it's the power of those that has, you know, brought not just me, but the field to where, and the stuff that we're doing to where it is now, which is a position, I think, of some influence.
No, it's great to hear you talk about that, and you're pulling it or you're hitting on some of the points that I think I talk about with young psychologists and people entering into the profession. I'll pull on some of those a bit
Yeah.
later. I just want to say I can definitely attest to the influence you've had on the younger generation. I've even got a copy of your book, New Psychology and Leadership, and that's not out because of this interview. That's because I was referencing it for my own work the night before last. So, definitely grateful there. I just wanted to kind of ask, what were some of the really key formative experiences early on in your career? So, having done undergrad, what were some of those key things there? And it sounds like some of the supervisors that you had a really
I mean, and that's really, I think mentoring is such a huge thing in any profession really. And I was just very fortunate. I had as I say, my honours supervisor, Margaret Weatherall, was fantastic. And I've maintained I don't see a lot of her, and I hardly ever see her, in fact, but I've been psychologically sort of close to her, I guess, all through my career. And she has a sort of great mind. She's a very critical thinker, very, but also very gentle and kind and sort of nurturing. And then John Turner, again, John could be a bit difficult, but he was kind of brilliant, and he was also very, very generous, incredibly generous, really. And really, I would sort of say, I really couldn't, and the quality of mentors that you have is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, I'm sometimes struck by how people don't take advantage of opportunities that they have. So I mean, look, if you're fortunate to have good lecturers or, good supervisor, I mean, don't, be, generally, don't, approach them, engage with them. Don't stand back and don't, I give, undergraduate courses and master's courses, and, a lot of the students, in a way, it's interesting how few students ever really just come and talk to you about what you're doing, and I mean, and I think maybe that's just because one of the colleges don't want to, not interested, but I think sometimes people are a bit sort of bashful or shy or retiring and stuff, but I think most academics are in it because they want to have those conversations with people, and they want to spread the word, and they want to talk about the stuff. So I think finding, if you can, space to kind of do that, and taking advantage of opportunities. So if your lecturer says, well, if you've got a question, come and see me, or something, well, go and see them, go and talk to them, and ask them, look, I'm really interested in this thing. Is it something I could read? And I mean, I think it's that type of thing. So I was always very just interested in psychology, and I would sort of really look to John and Margaret to things that I should be sort of reading and doing and thinking about, and problems I should be reflecting on, and that was, it was that, and they were just, and I guess in the context of those discussions, I would sometimes have kind of ideas, and I would say, well, I think there's a gap here, and they would say, yeah, possibly, maybe you want to look over here and that, and so it was but it was a very long process. I mean, again, I sort of feel, I mean, when I look at sort of young academics today and how productive they are, I was, for the first 10 or so years of my sort of career, I was working very hard, and I was engaged and kind of excited about what I was doing, but I wasn't really, in sort of contemporary terms, I wasn't very productive. It's a kind of strange sort of thing in that way. So I really did. What I would say was I focused less on outputs and more on inputs. I focused more. I wasn't as obsessed with like getting publications or other kinds of things. Or, I mean, I probably was. When I was a student, I probably was concerned with marks, but I really was actually wanting to understand things and see what kind of made things work. And so I did have that kind of curiosity, but I've always enjoyed really working with other people as well. Like I don't actually, the book Psychology and Organisations is it's certainly the only book I've really done on my own. And I don't, as you said, I have got quite a lot of publications. I've only got, maybe 2 or 3 single author publications. So everything that I've done, and I think I had to add this up, but on my publications, I've got something like 300 collaborators in something like 26 countries or something. So, you know, so that's the thing for me. And also that's what, you know, I remember something that John said to me, you know, when I was starting out as a PhD student or somewhere in the middle, he just said, you just got to understand, you know, academia is about survival. It's about, you know, it's about living to fight another day. And what's really interesting when I look around is a lot of my peers, when I was a PhD student, a lot of those people have kind of given up in particular kind of ways, or you know, and they've, you know, and I think they, you know, firstly, they were, you know, just maybe a bit unlucky, but they were never in those supportive environments. But also, you know, I've been powered on by two things. One is, you know, a series of questions that I've wanted to answer, you know, from the outset, and the other is just having good collaborators, you know, and younger ones who just like push you on. Like, so some days, yeah, I don't really work on another paper, but I've got an obligation to, you know, Nick or Tegan or whatever it is down the corridor, and yeah, we've got to get this thing done. So. And I think that idea that you're sort of kept afloat by other people and the structures you have in place around you is really sort of critical. So, you know, in a really kind of material way, just the having supportive systems with supportive people in them and investing in that and those relationships in ways that I think is kind of critical, because you can't survive in psychology or any other profession, I believe, on your own. I think the world's a very lonely place if you're ploughing your furrow kind of on your own, and so on. And academia particularly, you know, academia is a world of very, very intermittent reinforcement. You know, you submit a grant, you work for months on it, and your chance of success is 20%. You can't do that too many times on your own and then get up and do it all again, you know. And in journal articles, you know, the typical journal article I probably work on gets rejected. Well, I don't know. I'd have to look at it. But it gets rejected probably. I imagine it's on average of about 2 times before it's accepted, something like that. It's a huge variation. But you know, so you've got to deal with rejection and disappointment and failure. You run studies and they don't work or whatever it might be. There's a lot of things out there that could really set you back, were it not for the fact that you have the support of other people. And again, I think that's true in science, true in research, true in academia, but it's true in, I believe that's true in pretty much any profession. And again, and if you're unfortunate enough to come in the sort of orbit of some, you know, thug of a leader or someone who's, you know, punitive or really, you know, singles you out or doesn't allow you to get the oxygen of other people's support, that the world can be a very, very forbidding and unpleasant place, you know, as we kind of know. And, you know, and so again, I think, I think trying to model those things and make sure that you're providing norms that allow other people to be in environments that are productive, I think it's hugely important too. You know, and again, I mean, I was just saying, I was talking to someone the other day who, and this is an academic colleague, who's in a department where they have a really sort of toxic head of school, they have a toxic dean, they have a toxic vice chancellor. Everything about the place is just, you know, and I think, and it is a nightmare, and they are, you know, pretty depressed by it, you know, very, you know, they're very capable, you know, and I was saying to Kath, my wife and research collaborator, that they, you know, we're fortunate. I've never worked in a toxic environment. So, I mean, I've never been, you know, unfortunate enough to have somebody who's really out to get me or to just make life shit, you know. And but lots and lots of other people are not so lucky, you know. And partly, of course, and I guess that was a bit of our stuff on gender and leadership, partly because you know, some people end up in situations where they don't have a lot of choice about which path they go down. They have limited options, you know. So if you have options in this world, generally speaking, are fortunate, but again, you know, options are often only afforded to a particular sort of class of, or a particular cluster of people. And I'm very mindful of the fact that there are lots of people in organizational social contexts, generally speaking, whose options are very, very limited in ways that are very limiting, you know.
I just think, you know, I guess one of the things that has really birthed this whole project and you know, this interview is young people coming to me and asking for advice around early aspects of their career.
Yeah.
And one of the pieces of advice that I am always giving people is go and buy other people coffee. And you know, I was amazed in when I first, you know, graduated and stepped out into the world, and I went and bought as many kind of established psychologists that I could find coffee and just hear their story, hear their career, what they've done, and what advice they've got. And, you know, people are so willing to give that is what I feel.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm more than willing to do that right now. And really, to me, the advice that I give is, you know, networking is king. And collaboration is so important. And that's really a theme that's kind of threaded through everything that you've said so far. So did you want to just speak to the importance of kind of networking and collaboration?
Yeah. Well, I mean, absolutely. I think I think there's a couple of things there. Do those things. And if someone says, look, you know, if come and ask if you have any questions, come and see me. Well, maybe think about going and see them and saying, look, could I be okay if I talk about this thing? And you know, I don't really know none of my colleagues who wouldn't want to talk about their work or some aspect of it, or you know, talk through it. I mean, you know, that's kind of why we're in the game in a way, is to have those conversations. And in a way, you know, the most, you know, sort of profound form of flattery is just other people's interest in your work, your ideas. So like, who doesn't want to be kind of flattered in that way, right? You know, I don't think you have to be vain for that to be the case. I just think people, you know, having people who are interested in what you're doing is rewarding. So of course that's good. I mean, but I think there's two things I would sort of say. One is, you know, you don't, you know, if you're feeling a bit retiring and you're a bit apprehensive about doing it, I think, you know, just make an effort in classes to ask questions, you know, just like, so and I remember once when I first went to a conference, you know, and I was, you know, and I always had questions. I never really asked them. And John said, well, you know, just ask a question. And even if it's just like, is that number a 6 or a 7, you know, something really basic, just get the conversation going. You know, I think that's a good thing. But the other thing I would say too is, always bring something to the conversation. Don't, you know, sometimes, and, you know, sometimes you can get a sense that people are just like, you know, being not, I don't know how, but it's a bit like, you know, that they're, you know, it's like a sort of a sponge or something. This one, they're kind of like, I don't mean that in like the other, but just that, they're just kind of absorbing what you're saying. And that's fine. But I think it's so much better if you can bring something to it, like a point of view. And also, and then on the back of that, just do stuff, you know, say, well, could we do a study, or could we do this thing, or could I do some research assisting work for you? Or would you be interested in working with me on this thing? And, you know, someone might say no. I mean, they might say no, but again, I just think that, I just think the process, but so bring stuff, you know, and plan to do stuff and then follow through. And the other bit I would say, and this is what in our research team, as a you know, I don't know, and I talk about this with Yolanda, you know, colleague here at UQ a lot, and you know, I think as a research team, you know, I think it's very important that you're kind of functional as a team, and you know, do all the things, treat each other respectfully, and all those things. I think that's incredibly important. But I also think the delivery, you know, if you say you are going to do a project on this thing, then you're going to do those things, just do it, you know, do it. And you know, and Yolanda and I mean, Yolanda's made the point, and I think it's basically right, that, you know, all walks of life, there's quite a lot of people who talk a good game, but when the chips are down, they just underdeliver. You know, they just underdeliver and they let you down. Well, you only let me down once, right? And you only let us down once. That's fine. You know, I'm not going to hold, if you don't, I'm not going to bear any grudges. You know, life's too short. I really don't. But I'm just not going to work with you again. Like, so if you turn out to be someone who's unreliable or does things that are unethical or problematic, well, you know, and I think that goes for all of the people I work with. I think that's our ethos. Like, we just want to work with people who are good and engaged and open and you know, kind of up for it. But again, I do think, yeah, you've got to be willing to sort of do what it takes to follow through. And I guess in you know, there's lots of things that worry about me as a researcher, like about tomorrow or whatever. But one of them is always, you know, the day on which you just can't deliver on a project. You know, you say, well, we're going to do this, and and you're just not able to, sometimes it's really hard to deliver. But I think if you can be known as and again, not so much as an individual, but as a researcher in a research team, that basically if you go to those people and you ask them to get on board with a project, you're going to end up with something that's better than you would if you hadn't. That's then, surprisingly few, I think, sort of teams of research. I think one thing is if you're working on your own, it's actually really hard to do that. If you're on your own, if you're on a team, it's a lot easier to do that. So it's one thing. So actually, that's one of those spaces where, I am surrounded by brilliant colleagues who have all manner of skills and can get from A to B a whole lot faster than me. And if they're in the team and we have a problem which needs you to get to, from S to T or whatever it is, somewhere where I'm not familiar with the territory, they can do that. They can come in. So again, and I think of some of the big projects that we've run in recent years, really, really daunting. And I think, how the hell are we going to deliver on this? We've just done a big leadership program for the House of Commons in the UK. This is a massive project. I mean, and there was really IT stuff. There was, stuff going on with, analysis and data collection and just the structure of the thing that we were creating. There were some huge problems to kind of like grapple with. But having a team of people who are motivated to deliver on that and have the skills and can just, rise to those challenges as they come up is just a massive asset. So network, but network with capable people, but also make sure that you yourself, hold up your end. I think that's really important too. But being a reliable, honest broker in pretty much any walk of life will get you a very, very long way, in my humble opinion. And if you just stick at your knitting and you do it, that was, again, like, there was nothing, I didn't do anything very dramatic in my early career. In fact, I sometimes, I think I sometimes wince when I think about maybe some of my conference presentations and the sorts of stuff I was doing, and I think that was so undercooked, so raw, but it's good to have a short memory for those things. But as I'm saying, but what I was always trying to do was to try to, I've always put everything into it. I didn't leave anything on the shore.
Yeah, no, and look, you're talking primarily, I guess, in the academic world there, Alex, because that is your world. But I'll echo that from my perspective as a consultant. If you can work really hard and develop a reputation for being someone who can deliver quickly and to high quality, and be reliable, as you said, then even in the paid consulting world, you'll find the projects and gigs, and people will want to work with you, and that all that sort of stuff will just flow.
Yeah, I would say I don't think I've ever been quick. But I have delivered on time. It's just that I would say this is going to take a while, No, so, but I think and of course in some walks of life that's just not an option. No, sorry, we need that. And I think, academia probably suits me because there isn't. There are some things we have to do quickly, but most of it is the delivery is everything's a kind of a long game in a way. I think and I think that's true about teaching and stuff. Like I always think if I'm working with a student or a PhD student or a master student on a project, at the very least it's going to take a year until we've got something that's to speak of. So it's always a kind of long game. And again, I think even beyond that, like I think like with undergrad, I don't know, when I taught you, I would probably say maybe you're going to go away now, and maybe I'm not going to hear from you for another 10 years, but then, then people come back, and they come back in 10 years time. And if the seeds that you planted have basically been useful and have helped them, and the stuff, well, obviously the point is the people who it wasn't helpful, you never hear from again. So that's fine. But I think if there are some people there who for whom it kind of works and it hits the mark, well, it's not so much I believe in karma. I just think like if you make those investments, it's a bit like if you put a small amount of money in the bank, well, the interest will accumulate, and after a period of time you'll have something quite a bit more substantial.
Okay.
So yeah, don't I think that business of investing and nurturing and doing sort of husbandry around those things is important. But that again, I've been very fortunate. I've been in positions where I can make those kind of investments, and I'm conscious lots of people aren't in environments, they're not surrounded by, they're not encouraged to, or haven't got the space. My very first job was a nightmare. I mean, and if I had stayed in the institution that I was in for more than the year that I did, I don't think we'd be having this interview, put it that way.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So I guess in your position, Alex, you are in a position where you see a lot of the young people coming through and entering into the profession. What kind of stands out to you from the people that are coming through today, and what kind of advice would you give in terms of navigating those first couple of years of their career?
Well, firstly, I am, and I really say this briefly, I'm always, particularly like our master's students in the Master of Organisational, Master of Business Psychology. I think I think the students are really fantastic, because I'm in a group thesis year, and I've got, 8 students there, and they're all really fantastic. They're engaged, they're smart, they're fun, they're good to work with. They never let you down. I think that's great, and so that is really the best thing about academia. I mean, I talked about some of the downsides, but the best thing is that you're working with young people who are optimistic and engaged and capable, and that's really and again, working at a place like UQ, we're fortunate. We get the cream of the crop in many ways, and we have a good environment in which to kind of work. The greenhouse has got all fixtures and fittings, so I'm that side of my work is just great, that's kind of one thing. I don't know. I'm not much of a one for sort of giving advice. I'm happy to have a conversation with you and sort of tell you what I think. But I think one of the things I really don't like is at conferences, increasingly they have sessions on like how to publish and how to do this and how to do that. And I try not to do those things because I sort of think the world doesn't sort of work like that in a way. I sort of did receive advice, like as I've talked about, from my supervisor, really, really good advice, but it was in the context of just general conversations about work and life. And it wasn't like he never sat me down and said, okay, now let me give you 6 bits of advice. He just sprinkled sort of, little wisdoms along the way, and similar with Margaret and other people I've worked with. And it wasn't like, and that wasn't their style. And so I think, I would say, I was just happy to be in their company and to see the things that they did, that some of the things that were really effective and maybe some of the things that weren't so effective. And I think, and I've seen that with lots of my colleagues too. So I sort of feel that business of like, yeah, just look at what, I really do think I've obviously been to lots of these things where I hear, journal editors and the like, talking about this, that, and the other. And as someone who's done those things and seen some of these people in action, I'm going, no, that's not how you did it. That's wrong. That's not, you have got no insight. Either you're deceiving yourself or you're deceiving other people, or you're only talking about a particular aspect of the process. And I know that when I do that, I gave a talk, I was doing something like this. We did a summer school. This was in Ireland a few years ago, and it had that process. And so a colleague of mine came up to me afterwards and said, no, I don't think that was really right what you said there. And I said, you're probably right, and it was, so I worry about that. And I worry that you say something like, oh, you should do this. Well, yeah, that's possibly a good thing to do, but maybe doing the opposite is a good thing as well. So it's not like, I think if you sort of, as it were, hang out with the people who you think you want to emulate, that's a pretty good kind of thing to do. I don't mean like, stalk them, but I mean, just try and working out what's going on around them, in a particular way. And again, without being too like, I don't think you need to go in for sort of hero worship in any form. Like, I think look at the dynamics, look at what's going on in the bigger picture, I think is the thing, and so on. But then again, you know, again, but just maybe don't worry too much about that. Even that, I think that I would say, and the only thing again, this is getting dangerously close to like advice, but I would say, like, if you don't enjoy it, don't do it, and find out what it is that actually floats your boat. And again, I think the great thing about psychology, when I started as an undergraduate, my degree was in English and maths, and you know, and I you know, and I enjoyed them and so on, and I was, you know, reasonably good at them. But then I started doing psychology, and I just sort of thought, oh, this is really interesting. And at the end of the day, you know, and when I was making a decision about what I'm actually going to, you know, do my primary degree in, you know, I just kind of, it was a bit of a thing because I had never really thought about doing psychology, but it was just like, actually, I find this, I kind of enjoy this, and I didn't even have any idea there was such a thing as a professional psychologist at the time. I had no idea. I just thought, oh, this is, I think there's some stuff here that I would like to, you know, think more about. And I've kind of, the two things I've always said, like, if this work isn't fun for whatever reason, either because, you know, the people who are working on it, or the team, and this is pretty rare actually for me, but if I'm not enjoying working with a team of people or or on a project or whatever, I'll just gently just sort of, you know, just let it wither on the vine, you know. And actually that's right, if you don't feed it, it will die, you know. So you know, but I've been fortunate, again, the people I work with have, you know, I've always worked on interesting problems, and but that thing of, like, you know, I think it's a bit like in our garden this morning, we had to have a building because we've got a reasonably big tree. But what's really kind of interesting about this tree, and its roots, which you can't see obviously, but is how far the roots have kind of gone. And in the garden, in one of the trees, it's not a mopping great tree, but the root has gone like 30 meters to find some water, you know. And I think it's that, you know, it's like, work out where the water is. What is the thing that's going to nurture you, and go and just eke that out and go after it, you know, and so on. And again, the great thing about psychology, this is a sentence I was started a while ago and didn't finish, is there's so much. If you can't be interested in psychology, well, you've got a problem, because you know, I feel sorry for people who are studying, you know, other things, you know, like I really do. And actually I think, you know, history and English and political science, these are fantastic subjects, but they don't, you know, they have some really, really good stuff in there. And so, you know, but psychology has it all, really. It has something for everybody. And if you, and again, I think before we started recording this conversation, we were having a talk about clinical psychology. I think one of the interesting things about people, one of the reasons I think that, like, the organizational psychology master students, my general observation is they're a pretty happy bunch relative to some other things, like maybe clinical psychologists. And one thing I think about organizational psychologists is they've been going along in their undergraduate degree, and they have at some point made a really conscious decision to do organizational psychology because they suddenly found it was interesting, or it opened up things that they want to do. I think often people go into clinical psychology from the start, and they're just on that path, and they're so wedded to it, even when they stop liking it or thinking it's interesting, they just carry on anyway. Yeah. And so I don't there's not too many people who make their way into organizational psychology because, you know, because they came into university to study it, or, you know, or it was something they wanted to do since they were 6. But there are people, you know, and the other thing, you know, there are, well, you know, probably, you know, 30% of our undergraduates want to do clinical psychology because they've seen television programs about it, or they know about it and stuff. And that's great, you know, and of course, you know, my wife is one of them, you know, there's plenty in clinical psychology to be enthusiastic about. But if you don't ever find, if the roots of your tree never find out those never seek out the water, never find the water, that's a problem, you know. And that's not a, you know, and actually, again, one of the other really interesting, I often say to students who clinical psychology, and is most clinical psychologists end up being organizational psychologists anyway, because they're capable and competent, and they go into a healthcare system, and before you know it, they're actually in sort of middle management, and they're doing, you know, they're doing leadership, and they're doing negotiation and motivation and planning and all that strategy, all that stuff. Yeah. And actually, I think it's, I mean, one of the bizarre things, you know, there's plenty of bizarre things in the world, but in the world of sort of registration in psychology, is that sort of organizational psychologists are forced to do clinical psychology, whether they like it or not. They have to do all stuff on testing, but clinical psychologists are not forced to do organizational psychology. And when I take over the world, that will change.
I look forward to that day, Alex. I guess a bit of a segue into the final question I want to wrap up this conversation is where do you kind of see the profession itself, organisational psychology, heading and going? And for people who are beginning their careers today, what should they be thinking about?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think in a way, I have lots of different kinds of views about that. I mean, there's lots of bits of organizational psychology I'm pretty skeptical about. I think some of the sort of mainstream North American science of organizational psychology, I think some of that actually, in a deep sense, is in quite a bad place. I think meta-theoretically and theoretically, and I think I was talking with Nick about this the other day. He's doing a book on classic studies in organizational psychology. If you go back and read organizational psychology literature in the sort of 50s and 60s, there was a sense in which, and a very real sense, in which I think they were much closer to the sort of heart of the subject and the realities of organizational psychology than the science is today. And I think that's really interesting to observe. I think organizational psychology is, in a very particular way, has painted itself in the science of it has painted itself into a bit of a corner. And I think it's very individualistic. I think it's very managerialistic, and it's very sort of monocultural, and in the sense that a lot of organizational psychology just reproduces a sort of individualistic managerial logic from the perspective of people who own and run organizations, and lots of the perspectives of people on the fringes of organizations, in sort of disadvantaged groups. Those voices are kind of increasingly marginalized, I think, in actually just mainstream psychological theorizing. And that also relates to, I think, bits of the practice of organizational psychology, that I think there are whole bits of the practice of organizational psychology that are just serving the interests of, corporate interests, that are, that's absolutely fine, but often those corporate interests exclude other kind of interests. So we don't do, organizational psychology on collective action, or on industrial protest and so on. I mean, that's the point we make in the organizational text. In the 1950s, there was a lot of research on the dynamics of protest and change driven from the bottom up. Well, that sort of thing is pretty much completely absent from the literature now. It's on the fringes in some bit of critical management theory or something like that. And that's true in leadership. So we have developed this very corporatist psychology, which I think is very narrow. I think it represents a very narrow perspective on organizational life, and it serves very narrow interests. Well, I think that is a problem. And I think that, our work and the stuff has always been about trying to round that out and actually look at different perspectives and different takes and understand some of the social processes there and unpick those. Well, I think realistically, our voice has always been, we're a bit, there's no sense in which that bit of our analysis is mainstream. I think some of the social identity stuff is, but often people, they cherry pick some of the bits and they don't really look at some of the harder messages. So where is the discipline going? That's a choice. But I think if it sleepwalks forward, it will become increasingly corporatist and increasingly functional for some groups, but the people who own and run the world, but dysfunctional for others. So I think about something like Amazon in the UK, in the US, or something like that. That is an organization that really has, reaped the power of organizational psychology in a particular sense to subjugate, abuse, oppress workers, and more generally to in ways that have, destroyed, the book industry, in a particular way, So now that's that's one kind of vision of how organizational psychology can develop. But I think, yeah, I think as organizational psychologists, I think a broader kind of social antenna and a sense of responsibility to maybe, you know, feed alternative perspectives and ensure that we really speak to the challenges of diversity, and that we're engaged in problems of inclusivity, which is a massive problem in political, social, and organizational life in Australia and in most Western countries, you know, if not most countries in the world. I think, you know, we need to be doing and opening our minds to those things in order to tackle the huge challenges that we have, you know, as a society, you know, whether that's climate change or reconciliation or, you know, disadvantage, inequality, all of those things. At the moment, I'm not convinced that, as it stands, organizational psychology provides us with the tools to see those problems, to interrogate them, and to do something about them. So I was saying, you know, we talk a lot in organizational psychology about organizational change, but to me, the industry of organizational science is very much orchestrated to justify and explaining the status quo, and I'm not sure how long that, I don't believe that ever serves us really, and I'm not sure how long we can sustain that. That would be my rather you know, circumspect kind of perspective on those things. But at the same time, I'm, you know, I'm by nature kind of an optimist, and I do feel, you know, well, I have a lot, I don't have a lot of hope that my peers are going to play a role in that, or even I am, but I do think that students of tomorrow may be more concerned to get traction on those issues and to create a better and more equal world. At least I hope they are.
Yeah. No, and look, I just to kind of summarize and share my experience around that, Alex. I think it's, from a consultant's point of view, it's very easy to go in and use your skill set to achieve the specific agenda and reinforce the messaging of the corporate elite, whoever that is within the organization. But I think that the challenge of a really good organizational psychologist will be able to do that, but also in the way, in a socially responsible way, I guess, where you challenge the leaders and say, well, have you thought about this from the workers' perspective? And, you know, what is the responsible thing, not just the pure bottom line agenda? And I think, you know, where one of the strengths of your work is that you straddle not just organizational psychology, but also the social psychology and the health side of things, and you get those multiple perspectives. And so for early career psychologists, I think it's so important to get such a diverse range of experience and across, as you said earlier, psychology as a whole, so that you're not just kind of focused on one aspect of it. And I think the importance of collaborating with other people who are in different aspects of the profession as well. You know, I think about some of the collaborative projects that I've done with people who are much more, you know, have a much stronger clinical skill set than I do, and the benefits that I've reaped from that. And, you know, it's resulted in better outcomes for the client and their staff, not just the leader of the organization. And I think that's something that people need to, you know, young people entering into the profession need to be kind of aware of.
Yeah, I think that's kind of, I mean, I think that's kind of right. And again, as an educator, that's really, it's about consciousness raising around those things, I think is really important. And actually, I also think the irony is that if you do those things, it's in everybody's best interest too. It's not, actually, sometimes, you know, it isn't, you know, it isn't in the interest of management just to steamroller stuff through and to crush everybody in their wake. That isn't really the way forward. And so, I think, I mean, I strongly believe that. But yeah, no, well, anyway, but it's been very good to chat, and good luck with the series and stuff. And I hope people find it